Welcome to Left, East to West with me, Nikki Hill.
And me, Tom Parkin, and glad you're with us. Please subscribe and tell others about our show. This week, we're going to touch on the Ontario NDP losing an MPP to Mark Carney's Liberals, federal Liberals, but also causing problems for the Ontario Liberals. And we're going to talk about the Conservative Convention policy focus. And Nikki?
And our feature interview this week is with Aileen Machell, who is a political commentator, former journalist, and former Deputy Chief of Staff to BC Premier David Eby. She's going to give us a peek inside the BC government and into a worrying trip she had to Washington, D.C. for the Trump administration visit.
But before we get to Aileen, let's check in a couple of places across Canada with our This Week Below the Fold.
So we're going to start out with you, Tom, here in our Below the Fold this week. So there's been a pretty big shakeup in Ontario politics. We even felt all the way out here in BC. There was an NDP MPP quitting to become a federal Liberal by-election candidate, which is obviously a big score for the federal Liberals and some pain for the Ontario NDP. But it also has some knock-on effects as a real challenge for the Ontario Liberal Party.
Yeah.
What's the story here?
Well, it's a kind of a circuitous one. Last Wednesday morning, Ontario NDP MPP Dolly Begum had a meeting with Marit Stiles. She drops the bombshell that she's quitting, and Mark Carney has already appointed her, or going to publicly announce it, that she will be the Liberal candidate in an upcoming Scarborough Southwest by-election. That's the name of the riding she represents provincially, and it's the federal riding as well. The meeting must have been a real gut punch for Marit, without a doubt. Begum always seemed like a strong New Democrat and had... So what changed? I don't know. Certainly the way Mart presented it, there wasn't any real signal. And she certainly came across as more hurt and angry by the whole thing. But nonetheless, obviously a huge blindside hit. So there's going to be a provincial by-election called within 6 months. And this is the part where it gets really weird and interesting. For the Ontario NDP, they want to hold the seat, obviously, because that helps secure their claim as the alternative to Doug Ford. They're the official opposition. They have been since 2018. The Liberals have been in third. But if the Conservatives or the Liberals win it, that is, if the NDP loses this by-election, the Liberals will, I think, kind of push the claim that they're back a little bit by default. Now, given this moment, probably the best move for the Ontario Liberals would be to try and find somebody who can run on, frankly, Mark Carney's federal coattails, even though this is a provincial by-election. But there's a big problem with that, and it has a name. The name is Nate Erskine Smith. The day after Begum resigned, Erskine Smith announced that he wants the Liberal nomination for this provincial by-election. He's a federal MP. He's been there for a fairly long time, I think since 2015, so 10 years or so. But he's not, I would say, and I'm being a bit generous, he's not necessarily beloved within the Ontario Liberal Party. He ran for the Ontario Liberal leader and came second to Bonnie Crombie in December 2023. But he only got 26% on the first ballot, so not super strong initial support. But then 2 months after he loses the leadership bid, and after nearly 10 years as a federal government backbencher, in February of the next year, 2024, he says, I'm not going to run again. And then, so he's now not doing much. He's a backbench Liberal MP in the Trudeau regime. And then at the very end of the year, the roof caves in on Justin Trudeau, and he's running out of cabinet ministers on a daily basis. And finally, Nate gets the call after 10 years on the backbench that he's going to be a minister. And it's like, wow, this is great. I am going to run again next time all of a sudden, right? So he goes the other way. But that did not stick because, of course, Mr. Trudeau was dumped very soon thereafter. He quit. Mr. Carney took over, and Carney dumps Erskine Smith out of cabinet. So, okay, that's not so great. He's lost a leadership bid. He's made some enemies. That always happens. Then he, kind of gets this weird appointment, and that goes away. But then just because this is, at any rate, what he does, he goes on the old CBC and raises a few complaints about Mark Carney, saying that really his demotion from cabinet it didn't sit right, he said, and that he he's feeling disrespected, I think was the word that he threw out. So he's kind of an angry, bitter, maybe a little bit entitled guy. Um, so uh, so if he becomes the candidate in Scarborough Southwest, he can't really be the Carney coattail rider because he's like an anti-Carney kind of guy,
Right.
right? So it's a very
Right.
weird situation, but that's the strongest, probably I would say it's the strongest card that they could play. And then there's some other liberal intertribal intrigue. In the provincial election held last year, of course, Bonnie Crombie delivered another third place result for the Liberals. She tried to hang on as leader. She got a 57% in the leadership vote in September. And suspicion is that Nate had a little bit to do with that number being a bit low. So Crombie announces that she's going to resign as soon as a replacement can be found. But the Ontario Liberal Party isn't doing anything to find a new person. They're not naming a date. They're not rolling out a process. This process just drags on. Eventually, in January, Crombie just it's like
Yeah.
I quit. Right, I'm gone. I wasn't supposed to be hanging around like this for you guys to not set rules and get this race running. So she quits. They sign a new interim leader, and of course, everybody knows that Nate Erskine Smith is interested in this. And he announces the day after Begum resigns that he wants to run in this by-election. So the Liberals are now working on their rules for this leadership race. They haven't put them out yet, haven't started the clock yet. But allegedly, one of the rules they're saying is that he cannot run for the leader of the Ontario Liberals if he's going to run in this by-election. So that
Oh,
sounds
those are
like
specific rules.
it's a new kind of rule, it sounds to me. So the thing is here, what's going on is that the leadership race and the Ontario leadership race for the Liberals is kind of being defined as how do we stop Nate
Wow.
from dominating in a weak field? There's one MPP who's interested, and she's only been there a year, right? The rest of the names, I honestly do not know who they are. One of them was a Liberal Party president, but these are just folks, right? They've never
Hmm.
been elected to anything. So it's a weak field. And I guess, he's going to try and force himself on it and try and win. So we'll see. Certainly the central problem the Ontario Liberals have had is bad leaders over the last few elections, bad strategy, and they've had very bad vote efficiency, and that problem doesn't go away. But, the proof is in the results. And it's also very critical for Mart Stiles to win this by-election clean
Yeah.
and demonstrate the cost of, just to demonstrate the disarray of the Ontario Liberals, and that, if you want to get rid of Doug Ford, there's one party to do it. That message is only a strong message if she wins the seat. Anything else is a problem.
Yeah, it is interesting there with so many parties being impacted. Like I said, it was something that was quite visible even out here in the West to see all the sort of the dominoes fall into place here. And as we federal election watch, and as we think about where parties are seeing their strength, it was a big news story. So thanks
Yeah.
for covering it.
Yeah, it's a weird one. And I didn't even get a chance because there was this whole story last week about a whole bunch of police officers getting arrested in, murder allegations or attempted murder allegations. I mean, it couldn't get more serious. But you want to tell us a little bit about Pierre Poilievre here because
Hmm.
he did get through his leadership vote at the recent Conservative convention, but as we know, party conventions aren't just about votes. What else did you see at that Conservative convention that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, I think everyone was, of course, watching to see, and this is natural for party conventions, what Poilievre's numbers were going to look like. He got pretty solid support there. I think not surprising as long as we have these rumors about an earlier federal election. Parties want their leader to be in place for those opportunities. And I think they probably did a pretty good job before the convention of securing that base and doing outreach. We're seeing a little bit of a tone change from Poilievre, a bit more working with the prime minister offers up this week coming out of that convention. So, I think as they try to address the sort of the solid base support, dropping in the polls, that public perception, they've got a lot of factors. So I think it's that public perception piece I want to dig into a little bit, because I think, as a partisan, I think this is my 30th anniversary of being a New Democrat this year. I realized the other day, been to many a convention and actually spent a decade organizing the BC NDP convention. So, but they're even having all of that sort of experience with conventions, other people's party conventions are a beast even to those of us that watch them, because they all have their different culture, they have different processes, and they belong to those parties. So the parties can set up any rules that they want to do. They can set up their attendee rules, their delegate rules, what they're covering, the agenda, how much time they're giving to policy debate. All of these things are on the table for the party. They're not, there's no other restrictions to them. It's their entity. So, for us to sort of watch and see what happened at another party's convention is always interesting with that take as well. And so the big thing I think that was coming out of the Conservative convention was actually on one of those things, which is who gets to attend. And so they had a pretty hefty, from what I could see, and not being in attendance, fee for their delegates. So those voting members who are eligible to go and actually be able to vote on policy, vote for that leadership review. I think it was, almost $1,000 for that delegate range fee. I can say,
Wow.
I know I just paid my federal NDP convention delegate spot today. I think it was about $350, so a little bit of a difference. But the difference here as well is that, again, parties get to set these rates and set who gets to come. It is normal that you have your delegate rate, you have your observer rates, so people who don't want to be delegates or they want to come from other parties, and they can check out the convention, be in the space. They can't vote, of course. And then generally you have a media process to be able to observe as well, generally through credentialing processes. What the Conservatives had, which I don't think we've seen before, was actually a content creator waived fee to be able to attend. And so a really high attendance from what we would call online influencers, new media, if you will. People maybe will take out the media part, but that content creation being actually the name of what they offered up to get people who have strong online personalities, followings, podcasts, big TikTok followers, YouTube. So I guess maybe like Tom and I are those online influencers as well. Our numbers are not quite as high as
Yeah, not quite.
these right-wing folks. Yeah, that's a goal. But that is, what I actually saw were conservatives after the convention as well, going on social media and saying, it was great to be there. I'm a supporter, but this fee I paid was huge, to find out that these influencers who are, not that card carrying member got that waive fee to participate. And so we did see all weekend a pretty big social media posts from these influencers hanging out together, having a pretty good party, and enjoying their convention weekend, which, for delegates may mean more things like early morning caucuses and whipped votes and policy debates. So there may be something to this content creator fee that we should look into. But what I actually think is more important here for progressives to note is that we've seen, like, I think the right has done such a really top notch, like, you have to give them credit on the level of content that they're creating. And we've seen studies lately, there was just one in November, that shows that such a high percentage of Canadians are now getting their news more from these online content creators and influencers than politicians from mainstream media. So we know that when you've got there's a good plan to bringing these folks into your convention to talk about your convention, to talk to their audience, and to continue to spread your message. But also there's this interesting factor about where media would be credentialed. We have process here. You are bringing in people who aren't required to, share the news as it happens. There's a disinformation factor we're battling globally right now. And particularly, I think here where we haven't quite seen, we've seen a really heavy reach right now already from right-wing influencers into the public. And obviously, as those numbers and studies show us, it's happening. And also when we see something like a convention like this, that real intention to bring in more of these folks who are largely online to share this message, or, nuances of it and variations of it without any real requirements here on the fact base. So something to watch. Certainly something that I'm paying attention to because we don't see all of the news that people are getting anymore and how they're able
No,
to filter it and understand it.
not at all. And the Conservatives are really light years ahead. They've been on this one in terms of
So
developing and
much.
encouraging a whole smorgasbord of people on YouTube or doing podcasts or other things in social media that is like news, but is very ideologically oriented and is really telling the conservative story. And there's a whole network of this that they've fostered over the years, and like they have
Yep,
money, and they got rich
exactly.
people who will help, and then they've got algorithms that help. So the center and the left really, like, the liberals don't have a very strong game on this one, and I would say the left not strong at all. So for the New Democrats and labor movement, people like that, um, it's traditional media, and that means
Yep,
dealing with reporters who have these nasty things called, standards and ask questions that are maybe not the ones you want asked. Um,
yep.
and there's no one that's ever just trying to help understand your story. But that's what these guys do full time, and they've done it. And you know, the other parties are going to have to get. I believe bring some terms to this. It's Kitty Nikki Hill,
We have entry. Mary Jane was really big on trying to become the BC election favorite podcast cat in 2024
right?
when I was doing the daily Beyond the Ballot podcast, and she apparently is going for national podcast cat now. So here we are. This is MJ.
Okay, well, nice to meet MJ. But you know what we really got to do now is we got to get to a feature interview with Aileen.
We do. Okay, stay tuned for Aileen Machell. Thanks, MJ. We are happy to have someone join us today who's been at the epicenter of the government of BC for a number of years and has a lot of insights to share with us, particularly from the past year. Aileen Machell recently left her role as the Deputy Chief of Staff to BC Premier David Eby. She's a former journalist, a former staff person in the Alberta government, and we are really happy to welcome her to the show today.
Thanks, Tom and Nikki. So excited to be here.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us. So, Eileen, you're fresh off the experience of having worked in Premier Eby's office, Premier British Columbia's office, during some pretty tumultuous times. And you were there at some key moments when you saw that tumult face to face. So we wanted to start there with you and just talk about, tell us a little bit about the trip that you took down to Washington almost a year ago, I guess about 11 months ago, with Mr. Eby and some other premiers to Washington. You visited some members of Congress. You visited some economic leaders in business and labor communities. And you had some pretty high level and a little bit weird and shocking, I think, experience. So tell us a little bit about how that all happened.
Thanks, Tom. So, taking it back a few months before that, I remember the night of the US election sitting there with some colleagues and watching the results come in, with increasing disappointment and shock and a bit of horror. And I'm sure that many of your listeners were kind of in the same boat, having that same experience. But while it was, some negative emotions, I don't think I had any idea of what was to come. And so it was only, a few weeks after that that Trump first made his threats on True Social about the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And then shortly after that, in December, the threats around the 51st state started up. And that kind of started, the discussion around this trip that the premiers were going to do. So I got to be part of this experience, and it was kind of an unsettling experience, a bit eerie, but also powerful, where all of the premiers joined together as part of the Council of Federation, and they went with a few staff down to DC in February 2025 in order to meet with US lawmakers, members of Congress, business leaders down there to try to convey to them why tariffs were such a bad idea and how the tariffs were going to hurt the American people. And, one of the things that really stood out to me about that day was when the premiers were all invited to go to the White House and they met with some of Trump's top advisors there, including the deputy chief of staff to Trump. And after the meeting, the premiers came out of the White House and a few of them talked to media, and Premier Eby was one of them. And so he told the media, who he had met with, and then he talked about, some of the things that the premiers had said in the meeting and how they had expressed to these senior advisors to Trump that the 51st state conversation was a complete non-starter. So, we went from there to some more meetings. We met with some labor leaders. And then a few hours after that, suddenly this chilling tweet came out from the deputy chief of staff where he said, pleasant meeting with the premiers. To be clear, we did not agree that Canada would not become the 51st state. So it was an unsettling tweet, to be frank. And really, the vibes there were very tense. I think for the entire delegation, it was an eye opening experience. And certainly from the BC perspective, it was clarifying the message that we received that day because, we had come from an October election ourselves, a provincial election where we were elected with a mandate. And the message that we received that day made us realize that we were going to fundamentally change, the priorities
Yeah,
that were going to be in front of us for the year. So
right.
that day, our mandate did fundamentally change. And,
So, so
yeah,
yeah. So just take us through that a little bit. So, you get elected. You think you know what the lay of the land is here, what the voters are asking you to do, what you've committed to do, what the economic situation is, and then you get this bombshell, not just on BC, but on every provincial and prime minister as well. So how did that change? How did that change the premier's thinking about economic strategy? How did that change the mood of the people of British Columbia?
the premier at the time called it economic wartime, and
Right.
that's really what it felt like. So in BC, what we did was we put together this strategy that was summed up in 3 words, and it was called respond, strengthen, diversify. And the premier had kind of unveiled this strategy at this speech to the natural resource sector community and business community up in the city of Prince George. And really what the strategy was like how we were going to navigate this situation. We had to take a step back after the DC trip too and just look at, what the priorities were going to be. What was the context and what were our goals? So first, the world has changed and BC's place in it has changed. Two, our role is to look out for people. So, how's this going to impact people? Their jobs, their businesses, their livelihoods, and how is it going to impact the provincial government's ability to deliver for them, the strong public services that they rely on, like healthcare and education. So the main goals were going to be how do we protect jobs, create economic growth, and protect services while facing this threat. So the first piece, respond was all about responding through things like taking American liquor off of store shelves, which was a wildly popular move. That was something that all of the different provinces did across the country. And I remember in BC, what we had actually replaced the liquor bottles with in the public stores was this sign that had a maple leaf and it said buy Canadian instead. And that image was just, so powerful. And it was something that was, kind of carried in news stories across the country, but also appeared in some of the news stories in the United States as well. So, that was respond. And there were a bunch of different actions that provinces took, including BC, in that respond category, which was really about, hitting back with countermeasures to those tariffs. I think of all the response actions, the most powerful of all was the collective actions of the Canadian people. It wasn't anything that any politician did or any government did. It was Canadians as a group deciding that, we were going to buy local, buy Canadian, and we were going to avoid traveling to the United States, right? Like
Right.
that ended up having an impact of billions to the American tourism sector. And it even provoked like a pretty negative reaction from Donald Trump and his ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, who called Canadians mean and nasty because we were doing these actions and really standing up for our country and our sovereignty. So that was the response piece. There was also strengthen and diversify. Strengthen was all about trying to move forward major projects to create jobs and generate revenue so that we could continue to provide good, strong public services for people. You see this talked about a lot. Even Prime Minister Mark Carney is focusing heavily on major projects. And we put out a jobs plan in BC called Look West. Minister Ravi Kahlon led the work on that. And it really is the blueprint or the vision for the next decade and how BC is going to be the engine of the Canadian economy to try to really generate wealth and prosperity for the whole country during this time where we're being threatened by Trump. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you got a lot to you have a lot to tackle. So, Nikki, over to you.
Yeah.
You have some
And
thoughts on this one, please.
it's also, hard to think that that was only a year ago, or, just almost a year ago, and everything that we sort of been through as a country and their emotional roller coaster that, I think normal people now have had to come to get to know since the change in the U.S. administration. Like, I don't think people, we were in Mexico City in the fall, and we were talking to, I think they were Australians, and they were visiting and going up to the States. And I think they didn't have any context of, I think, how Canadians were feeling and what that response felt like and how wary, we were of talking about going into the States at this point. So I think we've just been through such huge change. Let's pivot a little bit. So I think, again, like speaking of a long year, it's also feels like it's been a really long January or a really long 2026 already. I think everybody did their, 2025 in the rear view New Year's posts and thought 2026 might be better as they felt like things were sort of stabilizing under our feet a little bit more coming out of the year. And then bam, you head into January. And again, we're back on this constantly shifting ground. So, but one of the things I think, and we touched a little bit on this on our last show too, on building out the dynamic between what we're seeing going on in the States and their actions, and then how that relates back to the conservative movement, not just in BC, but across the country. And so, immediately following that Venezuela attack, we saw the interim leader of the BC Conservatives jump on social media, celebrate it. Certainly not the only conservative leader in the country. We saw that from a number of them, including Polyev. And then we have seen this trend where the BC Conservatives have been pretty consistently adamant against some of the actions that the province has been taking in response to Trump's policy shifts. So, really the reasons you described as them being need. And then we saw this interesting polling lately where conservative voters were more likely to think about concessions if there was an invasion from the U.S. Why do you think we're seeing sort of these threats from the Trump administration not being as concerning to BC Conservatives or the conservative movement in general right now?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't want to lump in, all of the people who voted BC Conservative in the last election with this group, because I think most British Columbians care about the same things. They care about a strong and free Canada. They care about good public services like healthcare and education. They care about making sure that they have jobs and opportunities for themselves and their families. And I think that most people who voted BC Conservative last time in 2024 believe in those things too. I do think, though, that there is kind of a small and powerful group in the BC Conservatives that really are mega supporting, and they really believe in this kind of dangerous, divisive culture war style politics. And what we've seen certainly from the BC Conservative MLAs is that they do seem to cater to this small and powerful group quite a bit. For much of the last year, they were quite flat footed in responding to this new threat. They were often seeming like they were on Team Trump instead of Team Canada. They were defending him. They were saying comply with Trump. And they were fighting a lot of the actions that we were taking to kind of respond to that threat. A great example of that is when we removed American liquor off of the store
Hmm.
shelves. They couldn't even bring themselves to support that action. And even at the time, their leader, John Rustad, called it dangerous and
Yeah.
irresponsible. So, it's a real head shaker. On top of that, even the pieces that we were working on, or the BC NDP government was working on to try to move forward economic growth and create jobs and protect jobs for people, the BC Conservatives were standing up and trying to block that work as well. Prime example of that is the North Coast transmission line. the BC NDP government introduced a bill to try to move forward this transformational project in partnership with First Nations in order to create jobs and wealth opportunities that are really like once in a generation or generations opportunity. And the BC Conservatives stood up and tried to block it. It was completely nonsensical. And even recently, when Trump had, posted that photo on Twitter where he had kind of covered a map of Canada with an American flag, one of the BC Conservative MLAs was around that time still kind of defending Trump and instead was attacking Prime Minister Carney for his speech to Davos. So it was
Yeah.
completely, head shaking.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think
Yeah.
what that it
Time to
just
maybe
goes to
just not
show,
not do
yeah,
that, right? I
yeah.
mean, if you sometimes you can just take a pass in politics and let the narrative move on and join when there's something that you're going to be helpful on, rather than just looking like a I don't know.
Well,
It's hard to
and I
understand.
think and I think that that's evidence of like that they are intentionally trying to cater to this group of people with their kind of dangerous, divisive
Hmm.
politics. And I think it's really important for British Columbians and Canadians to be aware of this and know who they're dealing with.
Yeah. I so now you've got this opposition Conservative Party. They're in a leadership race. May 26th, maybe, is the election date, I think. And I saw a tweet about this from Jazz Johal, the CKNW Drive Home host, right? Just a couple days ago, and his tweet said, "Dear BC Conservatives, um, it's the economy, not political purity tests or banning sex changes for ostriches. Focus on what matters." Now, here's the thing, Aileen, I worry that Jazzy is wrong. I worry that he is actually I agree with him, but I worry that he's wrong because I worry that the incredible amount of noise that the conservatives, these kind of conservatives, really radical, kind of radical conservatives make about, ostriches, just sucks up all the air and creates, to mix metaphors, it creates a wall of noise, and it makes it very, very difficult, and it'll be very difficult with, I don't know, 6, 7 of them running around now, talking about ostriches, not jobs, coming out with absolutely nothing positive. It'll make it very difficult for your message to be heard. So what are your thoughts about, first of all, tactically? Okay, if there's this wall of ostrich noise, how does Premier Eby and the rest of the government caucus, how does it either break through that wall, go over that wall, dig under that wall to get its message to the public? And second part of that question is, what is that message or messages to different groups, that you think that the EB government should be carrying in this next few months as the ostrich? I don't know if they're ostrich lovers or ostrich haters. I don't follow it that closely. There are ostrich obsessed, I think we can say. So, how do we get past that? How do you guys break through that stuff?
I think one of the strongest things that social democrats can do in these moments is to just keep doing the work. That's the most important way of getting our message through. And it's important to remember that the BC NDP is in government, and so they need to show up. And it needs to be not just talk, but they need to show results, and they need to deliver, and they need to keep focusing on the things that people care about. Creating good jobs to support families, creating homes that people can afford in the community that they love, focusing on strong public health care so that families have the care that they need when they need it. And that is, I think, the biggest way for the NDP government to keep getting the message through is to just keep showing up for people, keep showing what you're about, keep showing what you stand for, and meeting the moment. And I think there have been some really good results so far on some of the big issues that people care about. We're starting to see progress in a number of areas. Rents are coming down in BC. Hundreds of thousands of people have been connected to a family doctor. And the BC government is really pushing forward a lot of huge major projects to create thousands of jobs that are going to support people and generate prosperity for communities. And that's the best way of getting the message through, right? Just keep showing up, keep doing the job, and keep showing what it is that you
Sort
stand
of,
for.
sort of play the long game. You know.
Okay, so in that sort of that vein, and my least favorite question to be asked, although I get asked all the time, so I'm going to still throw it to you. So there's been the prospect of an early election in BC as a topic. Obviously, with the numbers in the legislature, it's something we always have to watch. People get sick on votes that are of importance, and so. But how likely do you think we're going to see an early election in BC?
I think it's very unlikely. I think British Columbians don't want to see an election right now, for one thing. And I think that Premier David Eby and the BC NDP government have a lot of things that they're working on right now. They're trying to drive economic growth and protect jobs and really be the engine of the Canadian economy. And they're trying to protect public services during this really challenging economic time. They're trying to protect things like healthcare and education, and they've got to get through a budget. And I think they probably have a very strong legislative agenda coming up. So I think it's very unlikely. I do think, when you're in a one seat majority, sometimes it's not entirely in the government's control. So you may want to look at, what the opposition is doing and how they might act. In the year ahead, one thing I've noticed is that their interim leader, Trevor Halford, he's very active and kind of high profile for an interim leader, more so than I think we've seen in the past with interim leaders. And so that's something that kind of stands out to me. Like maybe that's something that shows, he or the party is kind of hoping for an election. But the short answer is no, I don't think it's likely.
Yeah. Well, I think Halford's also brought in some like better campaigners than Rustad had on the staff team, right? Like he's got some people who have some pretty strong communications chops and I think good networks in the conservative movement. So probably an upping
Right.
at the game there too.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. The points that the idea of just stay focused, stay on the what British Columbians expect you to do, show up. You know, um, by a bunch of measures, BC is the top economic performer in Canada, and we've got a couple slides here, Doug, our producer. If you could maybe put up this first one. This is for the folks who are watching on YouTube. When the NDP was elected in 2017, BC had the third highest average wage, well below Ontario and Alberta, like $2-3 an hour lower. Um, but last month in December 2025, it was the highest by a few cents, but it was the highest. Uh, then we look at the next chart, which is GDP growth since 2017. Here's BC, just a hair out of being the top GDP growth province in Canada since you guys were elected in 2017. Uh, well above Ontario, well above Alberta, which is in fact second lowest. Um, so that's another, I mean, a powerful story that you can tell. And I can hear people saying, "Well, yeah, but taxes, right? Income tax is going to be higher in BC, right?" Well, again, let's take a look at that. Here's the numbers on that from the Ministry of Finance. BC residents, this is just a chart broken down different income levels, what the average payable tax is in Alberta versus British Columbia. And for people like Alberta has a flat tax, a flat income tax. It's great for people who make high incomes. But on this chart, everybody, you can see everybody who's making 150 or less is paying less income tax in BC. BC is actually the lowest income tax jurisdiction in Canada for medium income workers and low income workers. So, here's my frustration. I think if you asked most Canadians to name the province with the fastest growing economy, the highest average wage, and the lowest income taxes, they'd say Alberta, Alberta, and Alberta. But in fact, it's BC, BC, BC. So help me on this. Where is this message? Why have we gotten stuck on some message that's untrue? And what can Mr. Eby and company do to show that we're not expecting utopia, but when you're doing something better than all the rest, you tend to brag about it. What do you think?
Tom, I think the challenge here is that, BC may be doing well on the economy, but it only matters if people feel it, right? The only thing that really matters on the economy is how people are feeling it in their day-to-day lives. And there's still, a lot of challenges that people are experiencing. And it's not just here in BC, it's across the country, but there are significant affordability challenges for a lot of people. And so I think, to properly tell this story, the David Eby government needs to keep focused on those issues of affordability and helping people, in their day-to-day lives. I think, you can't you can't distribute wealth if you don't generate it too. And so you have to focus on continuing to drive economic growth. You have to keep expanding industries, building major projects, creating jobs with good wages so that people can support their families and really help them with those cost of living issues. And so while I think, BC is doing far better on the economy than people give them credit for, there can't be any celebrating until that job is done.
Yeah, and you always like being in BC and hearing some of the speeches you hear all the time. But I think it's a good point, Tom, being not in BC as well, and what do the BC voters hear all the time, particularly when there's lots of noise. Aileen, we just have one more question for you today, and thanks for all this wealth of knowledge you're giving us. So, and this has been, obviously spiking up a fair bit in the news cycle. So, as Westerners, here we are, as the most West, we always get lumped into this concept of Western separatism. And so, on his recent trip to Ottawa, went to meet with the Prime Minister and other premiers. Premier Eby raised concerns over this report that the Trump administration officials had been meeting with Alberta separatists. And so he went as far as to call this treason. So where does, the Alberta separatist movement impact any of BC's decisions, if at all? And where does that show up? It's a pretty strong position from the Premier.
Well, first off, I don't think you'll see the David Eby government or any BC government for that matter make decisions with the intention of appeasing Alberta separatists or any separatists in Canada, right? Separatists are, kind of trying to fuel their movement and trying to spread this idea that Canada is fundamentally broken. And so I think what, David Eby and his counterparts are trying to do is show that Canada works, that Canada is worth protecting. And I think that, one of the things that BC has to do in this moment is continue to be a leader in Canada, be a leader for the Canadian economy, and keep trying to be the engine of the new Canadian economy so that we create jobs and generate wealth for the whole country. But the other really important piece of this is to really work at protecting those things that Canadians all hold dear, like public health care. And when it comes to the separatists, I grew up in a small town in Alberta. And so what I'll say about it personally is that it's really hard to witness. And I think that, in this moment, where Canada is kind of out there on the world stage, we all need to come together and really stand strong together as Canadians.
Thanks, Aileen. We really appreciate you taking all the time. And see you got a lot of great commentary going on, so folks should stay tuned. But really, actually, the deep dive I think is this meeting the moment phase we're in right now. So where you've been in the past year in particular has been so important. And thanks for that. I always want to say thank you to people who have done that hard work in government as well, because it never gets acknowledged enough. But thanks for also joining us today.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, we're at that part that we call Love It or Heave It. Something we love and want to keep, or something we'd rather heave and forever forget. What do you got, Nikki?
Well, I'm going for another love this week. I was going for a heave, but we don't want to have to call this Nikki's rants. We're just going to keep with our titles. So I'm going to give some love to the NDP federal leadership candidates, and particularly focusing in on the support and the cooperation that we've been seeing both publicly and just for members, but a lot of public, to get Neil Johnson and Tony McQuail into the race, make sure they get over the finish line in their fundraising as each of those deadlines approach for the candidates. And I think, the two of them started a really heartwarming effort to amplify each other early on and help as people who have some of the lower resource campaigns campaigns and they're building in their leadership teams. And then the other candidates, I think at this point, have all joined in, all sort of cleared some fundraising paths at different points for them and encouraged their supporters to make those donations and get them through the finish line. So I think, as we have so many negative spots, is why I didn't do a heave this week. So lots of negative spots right now in politics, but I've heard from so many people who just found this really heartwarming and inspiring and hopeful about how we can do politics a bit differently. And so, I'm going to try not to talk too much about the BC Conservative leadership race because, all the listeners outside of BC are going to be like, too much, but it's going to go on for months. So, there'll be a few spots. And I think it's what we saw with these NDP candidates, and there's certainly been a couple of times where there's been some mentions of each other in oppositional competitive ways. It's a leadership race, but the comparison to, I think, how they've all uplifted Sunil and Tony is so different. And what we're seeing right now in the BC Conservative race, which is where we're literally at the point where Conservative MLAs are asking leadership candidates to stop sniping at each other on social media because they're going after each other so much. So three cheers for those federal NDP leadership candidates for sort of showing how you can do it better.
Yeah, a little higher standard. It's nice to see.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is a good thing to think about, and I bet you your Conservative leadership race is going to get not so loving.
It is not loving in any way right now already. Now, there's a lot of popcorn for those of us who are not involved in it, but there you
Absolutely.
go. So what are you doing this week, Tom?
Well,
is it a love or heave?
Yeah, I am heaving the $6 cabbage. I was in the grocery store. This is last week. I was in the grocery store and I'm checking out. I'm at the checkout, and there's a head of cabbage, Nikki. A head of cabbage, $6.16. I'm like, when has cabbage not been like? I don't know. Like that just blew my mind. We've got since from December of 2024. Just gonna rhyme off some stats to December of this past year. The price of ground beef is up 11%. Chicken breasts are up 14%. Stewing beef is up 22%. And, I like a steak once in a while, but kill me, it's up 32% for a sirloin cut.
Yeah.
This is all StatsCan data, and, it just blows my mind. But what I'm really heaving is, we get these really dumb ideas. Frankly, that's harsh, but I think dumb ideas from both Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre about how they're going to solve this, because this is not a tax problem. Mr. Carney, got rid of the carbon tax. Inflation didn't even notice. It just kept on walking. And the idea that a tax credit is going to stop inflation, I mean, if you want to help low-income earners, I'm all for that, but this is not going to do a thing for inflation, to stop inflation. And, when it comes to like chicken and meat, these are overwhelmingly products that are raised here in Canada. So there's no foreign currency issue. So it's not a tax issue. It's not a foreign currency issue, foreign exchange rate issue. There's some sort of industry issue here, that is driving this. And I think it's beyond my level of sophistication to know, but what I would like to see, and I would switch from heaving to loving to see this, is some sort of independent advocacy that will shine lights on the industry and ask some hard questions. Maybe something like a competition bureau that has real teeth and gets let off the leash to go after some of the tactics that we know are going on in both the retail and supply food processing industries, that really need to be rooted out, because inflation is such a damaging thing. For working families, remember, it hits harder than anybody else, because working families pay more of their income on food. So we got to deal with this inflation thing, and I want to see more real debate, not these kind of fake ideas that we're seeing about tax cuts. That's not going to do anything anyway.
It's a good heave. Well, you can be Tom's rant this week, and this is where we find out that I don't eat meat, but I can tell you that the tofu and the beans are also up, so we can bring in the vegetarian posse to support your rant this week.
Although, Nikki, eggs, I don't know if you eat eggs, but eggs and milk, those horrible supply managed goods, those are down actually.
Yeah.
Since last year. So I that's kind of an interesting contrast. I would like to know more about whether the supply management
Yeah.
is helping keep those costs low, and that's maybe why conservatives despise it. But anyway,
Good research project.
yes.
Okay, there you have it, folks. There's our Love It and Heave It for this week. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for joining Left East to West with hosts Nikki Hill and Tom Parkin. We'd love to hear your comments, ratings, follows, and shares. It helps people find us. To become a Left East to West community member and to help us reach even more Canadians, subscribe using the link in the show notes. You can watch us on YouTube or listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search for Left East to West and subscribe. I'm Doug Hamilton signing off for Left East to West, and we'll see you next week.